Get out of my house. I don't need a junkie daughter." Can you imagine hearing these words from your own father? Those were the last words Richard Monroe said to his 17-year-old daughter before he shoved her into an October storm and locked the door behind her. She had no coat, no phone, no money, just a school backpack with her college acceptance letter inside the letter her father had just torn to pieces in front of her eyes. 4 hours later, a man would call him. Not the police, but someone far more dangerous. And when Richard heard what that man said, his face went white as a corpse. But by then, it was far too late. It would take 10 years for Richard to realize the gravity of his mistake. 10 years for a scared teenager to become a woman who no longer needed him. But on that rainy night, she wasn't thinking about the future. She was thinking about the man who found her bleeding on the roadside. The man who carried her broken body into his car while the whole city slept. The man whose name makes powerful men tremble. Alexander Castellano. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good drama. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Some storms are not sent to destroy you. They are sent to deliver you into the arms of your destiny. The morning of October 14th, 2014 began like so many other mornings in Cassandra Monroe's life. She woke up in the small attic room that had once been nothing more than a storage space before Patricia, her stepmother, decided that her husband's daughter from his first marriage didn't deserve a proper bedroom downstairs. Weak light filtered through the tiny window, falling onto the only photograph on the battered old desk, a picture of her mother, the woman who had died when Cassandra was only 12 years old, after a brutal battle with cancer. Cassandra looked at her mother's face every morning like a ritual, as if she were still here, still watching over every step her daughter took. She brushed her fingers lightly over the photograph and whispered as she always did, "I miss you, Mom." The room was cold in the autumn, but she was used to that, just as she was used to being the extra person in her own home. She changed into her uniform, brushed her hair, and slipped the acceptance letter into her backpack. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, a full scholarship to Boston University, the escape from this private hell she had spent 4 years of high school fighting for. She hadn't told anyone in the house, because she knew they wouldn't care. Or worse, they would find a way to ruin it. The only person she wanted to tell was her grandmother Margaret, who lived 9 miles away, the woman who always looked at her as if she were her entire world. Cassandra went down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. In the kitchen, Patricia was making coffee. A 45-year-old woman with dyed blonde hair and eyes as cold as stone. She didn't bother to look up when Cassandra passed by, as if the 17-year-old girl were nothing more than an invisible ghost. In 5 years under the same roof, Patricia had never called her name with affection, never asked if she was doing well, never treated her like a child of her own. Cassandra had stopped expecting that a long time ago. Rachel was sitting at the dining table. Her stepsister, 22 years old, beautiful in a sharp and icy way, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. When Cassandra walked past, Rachel looked up and smiled. But it wasn't the smile of a sister. It was the smile of a cat watching a mouse. "Up so early, little sister," Rachel said in a sugary voice. "Something good happen?" Cassandra didn't answer. She quietly took an apple from the fruit bowl and slipped it into her bag. She had learned that silence was the best way to deal with Rachel. Anything she said could be twisted, distorted, turned into a weapon against her. Rachel had hated her from the very first day she stepped into this house, shortly after Cassandra's mother passed away. She hated that her mother had remarried, hated having a younger stepsister, and most of all hated how much Cassandra looked like her biological mother, down to every detail. 5 years had passed, and that hatred hadn't faded. It had only smoldered, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Richard Monroe appeared at the staircase, rushed as always, his tie not even fully knotted. He was 52 years old, his hair streaked with gray, his face permanently marked by the exhaustion of a man weighed down by life. He passed right by Cassandra without a word, only nodding to Patricia and kissing Rachel on the forehead. "I'm heading to work. See you tonight," he said to Rachel before walking out the door. Cassandra stood there, an apple in her hand, watching her father's back disappear. He hadn't even looked at her. For 5 years, since her mother died, he hadn't really looked at her at all, as if meeting her eyes would force him to remember the wife he had lost, and he didn't have the courage to face that pain. Cassandra took a deep breath, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and stepped outside. The sky was gray, the cold wind carrying the scent of an approaching storm. She didn't have a ride like Rachel did. She walked 20 minutes to school every day, as always, but today she didn't mind. In her bag she carried an acceptance letter, a future, and hope. If she could just make it through this final school year, she would be free. She would leave this cold house behind, leave the indifferent stares, leave the father who had forgotten she was his daughter. Cassandra walked along the familiar road, unaware that this would be the last time she ever left that house as a member of the Monroe family. She didn't know that Rachel was standing at the window, watching her with dark eyes and a plan that had been quietly forming for months. And she certainly didn't know that when she came home that afternoon, everything she thought she knew would completely fall apart. The moment Cassandra's figure disappeared around the corner of the street, Rachel set her coffee cup down and stood up. The smile on her lips was no longer fake. It was the smile of a predator who knew her prey had walked straight into the trap without suspecting a thing. Patricia looked up at her husband's daughter, her gaze cold but complicit. The two women exchanged a look, the look of people who had planned everything carefully and were simply waiting for the right moment. "Today is the day," Rachel said quietly, and Patricia only nodded before turning back to her coffee, as if what was about to happen had nothing to do with her. Rachel climbed the stairs, her footsteps light and silent like a cat's, heading toward the small attic room. She had waited for this moment for so many years, since the day that woman first took her place in her father's heart, since the day that woman's daughter was born and stole her father's attention. Rachel still remembered the bitter day when her father remarried, remembered the feeling of being abandoned as he poured all his love into his new wife and their little girl. Cassandra. That name cut into Rachel's heart like a knife every time she thought of it. The child grew up more beautiful than her, smarter than her, and worst of all, she looked exactly like her mother, the woman who had replaced Rachel's own mother in their father's heart. The attic room was small and miserable, but Rachel hadn't come here to feel pity. She had come to destroy. From her handbag, Rachel took out the items she had prepared over the past 3 months. A small plastic bag filled with white powder, something she had bought from an addict in a poor neighborhood. An old phone, a cheap burner she had used to create fake messages with a drug dealer who didn't exist. A stack of cash, $2,000. Money she had withdrawn from her own savings account but would claim had gone missing from their father over the past few months. Rachel opened Cassandra's dresser drawer and shoved the bag of white powder into the deepest corner, a place anyone searching would find, but that looked carefully hidden. She placed the cash beneath a pile of old sweaters and slipped the phone into the pocket of a coat hanging in the closet. Every movement was calculated, every detail flawless. Rachel had watched enough movies and read enough news to know how to stage an undeniable scene. But the most important thing wasn't the physical evidence. The most important thing was her performance. Rachel stood in front of the mirror in Cassandra's room and practiced. She practiced making her eyes look red and swollen as if she'd been crying. She practiced making her voice tremble just enough. She practiced wearing the expression of a sister devastated by discovering her younger sibling's addiction. Her father would be home at 6 in the evening. Cassandra would return at 4. Rachel would wait until 5:30 to call him, her voice frantic, telling him she had found something horrifying in her sister's room. He would come home immediately, as he always did whenever Rachel needed him. And when he saw the evidence, when he heard Rachel sobbing about how she had tried to help her sister quit but failed, he would believe her. He would believe her because he wanted to. Because believing Cassandra was a troubled child would be far easier than facing the truth that he had neglected his daughter for 5 years. Rachel picked up the photograph of Cassandra's mother from the desk and stared at it. The woman in the picture was beautiful. Beautiful in a soft and gentle way, the kind of beauty Rachel would never have. She turned the photo face down, a silent declaration that the era of that woman and her daughter was over. Today, Rachel would take everything back. Take back her father, take back the house, take back the position of the only daughter she believed should have been hers from the beginning. And Cassandra, the sister she had never acknowledged, would disappear from their lives forever. Rachel stepped out of the room, closed the door, and walked down the stairs with quiet steps. Outside, the sky was growing darker by the minute, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm was coming, and Rachel smiled. Everything was perfect. Cassandra arrived home at 4 in the afternoon, her backpack heavy with books, but her heart feeling light. All day at school, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about the acceptance letter in her bag, about the door to her future standing wide open before her. She had decided that this weekend she would go to her grandmother Margaret's house and share the good news. Her grandmother would cry. Cassandra knew it. She would hold her tightly and say that her mother in heaven was so proud. Those thoughts made Cassandra smile as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. But the smile froze on her lips the instant she saw the scene in the living room. Her father stood in the middle of the room like a stone statue, his face flushed with rage, the veins in his neck standing out sharply. In one hand, he held a clear plastic bag containing white powder that Cassandra had never seen in her life, and in the other, he clutched a thick stack of cash. Patricia stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, lips pressed tight, her cold eyes staring at Cassandra as if she were something filthy, and Rachel. Rachel stood just behind their father, her eyes red and swollen, tears streaming down her cheeks, her face the perfect picture of pain and disappointment. Cassandra hadn't even opened her mouth when Richard roared like thunder. "What the hell are you, huh? What is this?" He shook the bag of white powder and the cash in the air, his hands trembling with fury. "Drugs, in your room. Money, $2,000, the money I've been missing for months. How stupid do you think I am?" Cassandra stood frozen, unable to understand what was happening. She had never touched drugs. She didn't even know what they looked like beyond pictures and health textbooks. And the money? She had no money. She had never taken anything from her father's wallet. "Dad, I don't understand," Cassandra stammered, her voice shaking. "Those things aren't mine. I don't know where they came from." But Richard didn't listen. He stormed toward her like a hurricane, his face twisted with anger. Rachel cried louder, her voice choking with dramatic anguish. "Dad, I really tried to help her. I knew she had a problem months ago, but I thought I could help her stop. I didn't want to hurt you, so I kept it hidden. But I can't hide it anymore. I found these things in her room and I was so scared." Rachel ran to Richard and clung to him, sobbing against his shoulder. And Cassandra saw it, just for a split second, when Rachel lifted her face and looked at Cassandra over their father's shoulder. Those tear-filled eyes flashed with triumph. A smile hidden behind the tears, the satisfaction of someone who had waited far too long and had finally tasted victory. Cassandra understood everything in that instant. Rachel. Rachel had done all of this. "Dad, I swear to you," Cassandra pleaded, taking a step forward. "Those things aren't mine. Someone put them in my room. You have to believe me." But Richard didn't believe her. He shoved her away, his eyes filled with a disgust she had never seen before. "Believe you?" He laughed bitterly. "Rachel has evidence. There are messages on your phone talking to drug dealers. You think you could hide it? What phone?" Cassandra screamed in desperation. "I don't have a phone. You know I don't have a phone because Patricia won't let me have one." She turned toward her stepmother, pleading in her eyes. But Patricia only looked away, her lips curling into a mocking smile that Cassandra caught just in time. No one stood up for her. No one believed her. In her desperation, Cassandra remembered the letter in her bag, the only proof that she was a good student, someone who deserved a future. She hurriedly opened her backpack and pulled out the envelope stamped with the seal of Boston University. "Dad, look at this," she said, her voice trembling but filled with hope. "My acceptance letter. A full scholarship. If I were really an addict like you say, how could I have this?" Richard snatched the envelope from her hand. He looked at it for 1 second, 2 seconds, and Cassandra saw his eyes waver, as if something inside him were starting to crack. But then Rachel spoke, her voice sweet like poison. "Dad, grades can be bought. Maybe she used the money she stole to pay for them. Don't let her fool you again." Richard's gaze hardened. He looked at the letter in his hand, looked at Cassandra, and then he did something she had never imagined. He tore it. He ripped the acceptance letter, her ticket to the future, into tiny pieces right in front of her eyes. The scraps of paper drifted to the floor like snow, and with them Cassandra's heart shattered piece by piece. "I don't have a drug-addicted daughter," Richard roared, his voice cold as ice. "I don't need a daughter like you in this house." Richard seized Cassandra's arm and dragged her toward the front door. His grip was so tight she could feel each finger digging into her skin, leaving bruises she would carry for days afterward. Cassandra tried to resist, tried to cling to anything she could reach, the edge of a chair, the stair railing, the door frame, but she was only a thin 17-year-old girl, and her father was a grown man consumed by blind rage. "Dad, please," she cried, her voice breaking into choking sobs. "I didn't do anything wrong. You have to believe me. Let me explain." But Richard didn't listen. He didn't want to listen. He flung the front door open and shoved Cassandra outside with such force she nearly fell down the steps. Her backpack followed her, thrown after her like a bag of trash. Outside, the October storm had fully arrived. The rain was no longer a light drizzle. It poured down as if the ocean itself were being emptied from the sky. Wind screamed through the bare trees, icy and sharp like knives slicing into her skin. Cassandra turned back and looked at her father standing in the doorway, and she saw something colder than the storm itself. Indifference, disgust, complete abandonment. "Get out of my house," Richard said, his voice terrifyingly calm, as if he were speaking to a stranger rather than his own daughter. "I don't need a drug-addicted daughter. If you die on the street, don't ever come back here." The door slammed shut. The lock clicked in the rain like a gunshot. Cassandra stood there on the steps of the house she had lived in for 17 years, staring at the oak door her mother had once chosen. Unable to believe this was happening, she pounded on the door, slammed her fists against the wood until her hands ached, until the sound of her blows was swallowed by the screaming rain. No one opened it. No one came out. She looked up at the upstairs window, Rachel's window, and saw a figure standing there. Rachel was looking down at her, and even through the distance and the curtain of rain, Cassandra could see the smile on her sister's lips. The smile of a victor. The smile of someone who had gotten everything she wanted. Cassandra stood in the rain for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe longer. She didn't know. Time lost all meaning as she stood there, soaked from head to toe, trembling not only from the cold but from shock, from pain, from the collapse of everything she had believed in. She wore only her thin school uniform, a white blouse and a dark blue skirt. No coat, no sweater. Her canvas shoes were completely soaked, and she could feel each cold drop of rain running down her back, seeping through the fabric, touching her skin. She didn't have a phone. She didn't have money. She didn't have identification. All she had was her backpack with a few textbooks, some pens, and the torn pieces of her acceptance letter she had hurriedly picked up before being dragged out of the house. Cassandra finally lifted her backpack, slung it over her shoulder, and began to walk. She had no plan, no clear destination. Her legs moved on their own because standing still meant freezing to death. Then, through the white blur of rain and the chaos in her mind, an image appeared. Her grandmother Margaret, the warm little house smelling of apple pie and coffee. Arms always open, ready to hold her. The only person left in this world who still loved her. Her grandmother's house was 9 miles away. 9 miles in a storm, without a coat, without money for a taxi or a bus. But Cassandra had no other choice. She turned east and began to walk toward her grandmother's home, toward the only remaining light in her life. Every step was a battle against the wind and rain, against the cold sinking deeper into her bones, against the despair clinging to her heart. But she kept walking, because she had nothing left to lose, because if she stopped, she would completely fall apart. And Cassandra Monroe, even at only 17 years old, even after losing everything, wasn't ready to collapse. Not yet. Behind her, the Monroe house slowly disappeared into the rain, and she didn't look back. She didn't know that would be the last time she ever saw that house as a daughter. The first mile wasn't too difficult. Cassandra walked along the familiar road, the same road she took to school every day, and she told herself she would be fine. It was just rain, just a little cold. She would make it to her grandmother's house. Her grandmother would open the door, hold her, and everything would be all right. She repeated those words in her mind like a spell, as if believing hard enough could make them come true. But by the second mile, the spell began to lose its power. The rain didn't let up. It grew heavier, the drops lashing against her face like whips. The wind blew straight from the east, the exact direction she was heading, turning every step forward into a battle with nature. Cassandra's clothes were completely soaked now, heavy and clinging to her body like a second skin made of ice. She began to shake, not a light shiver but an uncontrollable trembling, her whole body quaking like a leaf in the wind. By the third mile, Cassandra could no longer feel her fingers. She tried to grip the strap of her backpack, but her fingers wouldn't obey. They were stiff and numb, as if they no longer belonged to her. She looked down at her hands and saw they had turned a pale, bluish white, a color that didn't belong on living skin. Cold. So cold. She'd never known cold could hurt like this. It wasn't just discomfort. It was torture. Every cell in her body screaming for warmth she had no way to give. By the fourth mile, Cassandra began to talk to her mother. "Mom," she whispered into the rain and wind, her lips so numb she wasn't sure any sound came out. "Where are you? Can you see me? I'm so cold. Mom." No one answered. Of course. Her mother had been gone for 5 years. But in the delirium of exhaustion and hypothermia, Cassandra imagined she could hear her mother's voice somewhere in the wind, gentle and warm, telling her to keep walking, not to stop, that her daughter was strong. By the 5th mile, Cassandra's legs began to fail her. Each step took an enormous effort, as if she were dragging blocks of concrete instead of her own legs. Her canvas shoes had doubled in weight from the water, and she could hear it sloshing inside with every step. She fell for the first time there, her knee slamming into the wet asphalt, a sharp burst of pain, but she scrambled back up and kept going. By the 6th mile, hope began to flicker like a candle in the wind. Cassandra no longer knew where she was. Darkness had fully settled, and the streets were empty, not a single person in sight. Occasionally a car passed by, headlights sweeping across her like indifferent eyes, but none of them stopped. She was just a shadow by the roadside, a dark shape in the rain, nothing anyone wanted to look at too closely, nothing anyone wanted to get involved with. Cassandra tried to raise her hand to wave, but her arm wouldn't lift, and even if it had, she wasn't sure anyone would stop to pick up a young girl soaked to the bone in the middle of a stormy night. By the 7th mile, Cassandra began to forget where she was going. Her mind was foggy, as if wrapped in a thick mist. Thoughts came and went, nothing staying long enough to hold on to. She remembered she was walking to someone's house. But whose? Why? She remembered someone loved her. But who? And where were they? Why was she out here alone in the storm? What had happened? The questions spun in her head, but no answers came. Grandma! The word suddenly flashed through Cassandra's mind like lightning. Grandma Margaret. Her house was 2 miles away. Just 2 miles. She could do it. She had to. But Cassandra's body had reached its limit. At some point, willpower was no longer enough to make up for a body shutting down. Her steps grew shorter, slower, more unsteady. Her head drooped, her eyes closed, and she no longer looked at the road. She only felt the ground beneath her feet and tried to place one step after another. Left, right, don't fall, don't stop. If she stopped, she wouldn't ever get up again. Cassandra didn't know how far she had gone. She didn't know how much farther her grandmother's house was. She only knew her legs were giving out. Her body was surrendering, and she was about to collapse on this dark road with no one knowing she was there. Mom, Cassandra whispered one last time. I'm sorry. I tried. And then she heard a car. The sound of the car came from behind her, headlights slicing through the curtain of rain like 2 blazing eyes tearing open the darkness. Cassandra turned her head, the last flicker of survival instinct still alive inside her, but her body no longer obeyed the commands of her mind. She wanted to step aside, to move out of the lane, but her numb, frozen legs managed only half a turn before giving out. The car was moving far too fast for a stormy night like this. The driver didn't see her, or saw her too late to react. Cassandra barely had time to register the blinding glare of the headlights swallowing her vision, the shrill scream of brakes against wet asphalt, and then something slammed into her with terrifying force. It wasn't the body of the car. She had fallen before a direct impact, but the right side mirror clipped her shoulder and head as the vehicle sped past. The collision flung her toward the roadside like a discarded doll. Cassandra hit the ground hard, her back crashing against gravel and stone, and she heard a sickening crack from inside her chest. Ribs, at least 1, maybe 2, had just broken. Pain surged through her like a tidal wave, swallowing every other thought and sensation. Cassandra opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her lungs felt crushed, each breath a form of torture. The car didn't stop. She heard the engine fade into the distance, tires grinding against the wet road, and then silence. The driver fled, leaving her lying there in the rain like a wounded animal waiting to die. Cassandra tried to move, tried to sit up, but her body refused every command. She could only lie there, staring up at the starless sky as rain battered her face, her eyes, her mouth. Something warm flowed down from her head, mixing with the icy rain, and she knew it was blood. Her left wrist throbbed with unbearable pain. She had thrown her hand out to break the fall, smashing it against the rocks. The skin was torn open, blood pouring freely. She could feel the warm stream slipping between her fingers, dripping onto the ground and merging with the rainwater pooling beside the road. Cold. Everything was unbearably cold. Cassandra lay there, gazing at the black sky, and she thought of her mother. Had her mother lain like this too in her final days on the hospital bed? Had she felt this cold as her body slowly let go? Was she afraid? I'm so scared, Mom. Tears slid from the corners of Cassandra's eyes, blending with the rain, and she couldn't tell whether she was crying from physical pain or from the despair devouring her soul. 17 years of life. Was it really going to end like this? On an empty road, on a rainy night, alone, with no one knowing she was here, no one caring whether she was alive or dead. Her father was probably sitting in a warm living room, satisfied that he had gotten rid of his worthless daughter. Rachel was probably celebrating her victory. Patricia was probably watching television as if nothing had happened. And Cassandra lay here bleeding, fading, utterly alone. Grandma. Cassandra thought of Margaret, of the warm little house less than 2 miles away, of the open arms she would never get to reach. I'm sorry, Grandma. I can't make it to you. Cassandra's vision began to blur. Black spots crept in from the edges and slowly spread toward the center. She tried to keep her eyes open, tried to fight the darkness closing in, but her body was completely spent, each heartbeat slower than the last. each breath shallower than the one before. She was dying, and she knew it. In the final moment before the darkness swallowed everything, Cassandra thought she heard another car stop nearby. A door opening, footsteps on wet gravel, and then a deep voice, commanding, cold yet urgent, cutting through the rain somewhere above her. "Call a doctor. Now." Then strong hands lifted her, powerful yet strangely careful. And Cassandra caught the scent of expensive cologne, of leather, of something entirely foreign to the world she had known. "Don't sleep," the voice ordered, and she felt a hand touch her face, forcing her eyes open. "Look at me. Open your eyes." She tried to look, tried to focus, and she vaguely saw an angular face, steel-gray eyes, and a scar running from the temple down to the cheekbone. Then the darkness surged forward and swallowed everything. That night, Alexander Castellano was on his way home, after a meeting most people would have called an execution. The smell of gunpowder still clung to his hands despite having washed them thoroughly, and in his mind echoed the begging of the traitor before the bullet ended every lie. At 36 years old, Alexander had seen enough death that it no longer haunted him. He sat in the back seat of a black Maybach, staring out through the rain-streaked window, thinking of nothing at all. Lorenzo, his right-hand man, sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror to watch his boss. The car moved through the night, smooth and powerful, like the empire Alexander had built over 8 years since his uncle died and handed him this dark crown. The headlights swept through the rain, and just as Alexander was about to close his eyes, he saw it, a body lying by the roadside, half on the grass, half on the asphalt, small, motionless. The driver saw it too, and instinctively began to accelerate, intending to pass by, because in their world, things lying on the side of the road at night were rarely something to get involved with. But Alexander raised his hand. "Stop." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough authority that the car braked immediately. Lorenzo turned to look at him, confusion in his eyes. "Boss, we shouldn't get involved. It could be a trap, could be police watching nearby. Best to call emergency services and move on." Alexander didn't answer. He opened the car door and stepped out, letting the rain soak his $1,000 suit without a second thought. He walked toward the motionless body, and as he got closer, he saw it was a girl. Young, very young, maybe 16 or 17. She wore a school uniform, soaked through and torn in places. Blood ran from her head, from her wrist, blending with the rain into pale pink streaks across the road. Her lips were blue, her skin waxy white, and without looking closely one might have thought she was already dead. But Alexander looked closely. He knelt beside her and placed 2 fingers against her neck. A pulse, weak, frighteningly slow, but still there. She was dying, but she wasn't dead yet. Lorenzo hurried up behind him, eyes scanning the scene with concern. "Boss, we really should call 911 and leave. We shouldn't be here when the police arrive. You just finished dealing with the Marconi situation tonight. If anyone connects you to this scene, it'll be trouble." Alexander didn't listen. He looked at the girl's face, at the tear tracks still clinging to her cheeks beneath the rain, at the way she lay there utterly helpless in the darkness, and he felt something painfully familiar. 26 years ago, there had been a 10-year-old child standing in the rain just like this, staring at his mother lying on the floor with a bullet wound in her chest, blood pooling beneath her, and his own father holding the smoking gun. That child had stood there for 2 hours, shaking, crying without sound, until his uncle arrived and took him away. That child had been Alexander, and the look on this girl's face, even unconscious, carried the same thing that 10-year-old boy had carried back then. Abandonment. Absolute loneliness. The pain of being betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most. Alexander didn't know this girl's story. He didn't know why she was lying here alone in a storm with her body broken. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave her here. He couldn't let her die the way his mother had died, alone and unseen. "Call Dr. Romano," Alexander ordered, his voice as cold as ever, though his eyes were not. "Tell him to prepare the emergency room. We're taking this girl back to the estate." "Boss!" Lorenzo started to protest, but Alexander had already bent down, carefully sliding one arm beneath the girl's back and the other under her knees, lifting her as if she were a child. She was terrifyingly light, all bone beneath soaked fabric, and he could feel every ridge of her frame. "Don't sleep," he told her, not knowing if she could hear him. "Look at me. Open your eyes." The girl's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, long enough for Alexander to see the clearest green eyes he had ever seen. Eyes full of pain but not a trace of hatred. Then they closed again, her head falling against his chest, and he felt her faint breath warm and fragile against his neck, like a candle flickering in the wind. Alexander carried her to the car and laid her across the back seat, her head resting in his lap. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her, knowing it wouldn't help much. She needed a doctor. She needed blood. She needed a miracle. Drive. Fast, he ordered, and the Maybach surged into the night like a hunting beast. Alexander looked down at the girl in his arms, at the blood still seeping from the wound on her head, and he wondered why he was doing this. He was Alexander Castellano, the most feared mafia boss in Boston, the man the entire city whispered about in terror. He didn't save people. He killed them. But tonight, looking at this girl, he couldn't do anything else, because leaving her there to die would have killed something inside him that he had believed had died 26 years ago. Cassandra woke up in a room she had never seen in her life. The first thing she felt was softness, an unfamiliar, gentle comfort wrapping around her body as if she were lying on a cloud. The second thing was pain. Crashing over her, the instant consciousness returned. Pain in her head, pain in her chest, pain in her wrist, pain everywhere. She tried to sit up, but her body didn't respond. Her chest felt as if a heavy stone were pressing down on it, and all she could do was lie there, gasping for air, eyes wide as panic set in. The room was 3 times larger than the attic space she'd lived in at the Monroe house. The ceiling rose high above her, crowned with a crystal chandelier that caught the light even in dimness. Dark red velvet curtains covered the windows, letting in only thin strands of daylight that told her it was now morning. The bed beneath her was a king-size bed with an intricately carved wooden frame, white silk sheets softer than anything she'd ever touched. An IV line was taped to her arm, her left wrist carefully bandaged, and she could feel tight wraps around her ribs beneath the unfamiliar nightgown someone had changed her into. "Where am I?" Cassandra tried to speak, but her voice came out hoarse and barely audible. "Where am I? What happened?" Memories flooded back in a violent rush. The storm. The rain-soaked night. Being thrown out of the house. Walking through the cold. Headlights rushing toward her. Blood. Pain. And then a deep, commanding voice. Strong hands lifting her. The scent of expensive cologne. Steel, gray eyes. Panic surged. Cassandra tried to move again despite the pain screaming through her body. She had to get out. She didn't know where she was, who had brought her here, or what they wanted from her. She was just a 17-year-old girl with nothing. Why would anyone bring her to a place like this? "Stay still. You have broken ribs. You shouldn't move." The voice came from the doorway, deep, cold, and carrying such authority that Cassandra obeyed before she even realized it. She turned her head and saw him. A man stood framed by the door, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit, as if he had just come from a meeting or was about to attend something important. Black hair, gray eyes, a sharply angled face marked by a scar running from his temple down his left cheekbone, a scar that made him look both dangerous and unreadable. He didn't smile or soften his expression. He simply watched her with eyes she couldn't decipher. Cassandra swallowed, her throat burning dry. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Where am I? Why am I here?" The man didn't answer right away. He stepped into the room, his movements calm and assured, like someone who owned not just the room but everything beyond it. He stopped beside the bed and looked down at her, his gaze holding something Cassandra couldn't name. Not pity, not curiosity, perhaps concern, buried beneath layers of ice. "Who do you want me to call?" he asked instead. "Your father, the police." The words cut into Cassandra's chest like knives. Her father, the man who had torn her future apart, thrown her into the storm, and told her not to come back even if she died. Tears spilled before she could stop them, streaking down her face and soaking into the white silk pillow. She shook her head, the small motion sending sharp pain through her ribs. "There's no one to call," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My father doesn't want me. No one wants me." The man was silent for a long moment, watching her with an expression she couldn't understand. Then he spoke, his voice still cold but changed, softened slightly, like ice beginning to crack. "You mentioned your grandmother while you were drifting in and out. Margaret Collins. Her house is less than 2 miles from where I found you." Cassandra lifted her head, her heart racing. Grandma. She had been trying to reach her. She had almost made it. "I'll take you there," the man said. "But first you need to recover. The doctor says you have 2 broken ribs, a mild head injury, a deep laceration on your wrist that required 12 stitches, and severe hypothermia. If I'd found you 30 minutes later, you wouldn't be here talking to me now." Cassandra looked at him. Confusion, gratitude, and fear tangled together inside her. "Why did you save me?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "You don't even know who I am." The man didn't answer directly. He studied her for a long moment, then said something she would remember for the rest of her life. Not every monster is evil, little one, and not every family is good. He turned to leave, and Cassandra rushed to ask, "Who are you?" He paused at the door and glanced back over his shoulder. "My name is Alexander Castellano. You're in my house. No one will hurt you here." Then he walked out, leaving Cassandra alone with her racing heart and a name echoing in her mind. Castellano. She had heard that name before, in whispered stories at school, in news reports about the criminal underworld she'd stumbled upon, the most feared mafia boss in Boston, the man the entire city was afraid of, and he had just saved her life. Cassandra stayed at the Castellano estate for an entire week after that, not because she wanted to, but because her body simply wouldn't allow her to go anywhere. Dr. Romano, a middle-aged man with silver hair and remarkably steady hands, visited her twice a day, checking her injuries, changing her bandages, and shaking his head every time she asked when she could leave. "Your ribs need at least 3 weeks to heal," he told her in a firm voice that still carried genuine care, "and the head wound needs monitoring to make sure there's no brain injury. You're extremely lucky, child. If Mr. Castellano hadn't found you, you'd be in the morgue right now, not in this bed." During the first few days, Cassandra did little more than lie there, aching both physically and emotionally. She cried often, crying when she thought of her father, crying when she thought of Rachel, crying when she remembered the moment her acceptance letter was torn to pieces in front of her. She cried for her grandmother, who must have been worried sick not knowing where she was, and for the fact that she had no way to contact her. Alexander didn't appear often, but whenever he did, Cassandra could sense his presence even before she saw him. He asked if she needed anything, if she was in pain, if she wanted to eat. Brief, practical questions without a trace of sentimentality or pity. Cassandra didn't know how to feel about him. He was Mafia, a criminal, a man she should fear and stay away from. But he was also the man who had saved her life, who had brought her into his home, who had arranged for a private doctor to care for her as if she mattered. On the 4th day, when Cassandra was finally able to sit up without the pain nearly making her faint, she received an unexpected visitor. The bedroom door opened and a woman stepped inside, small in stature but radiating such authority that the air in the room seemed to thicken. She looked to be around 70 years old, her silver hair neatly swept up, dressed in an elegant black dress with a string of pearls at her neck, and her sharp gray eyes, identical to Alexander's, fixed on Cassandra without blinking. Cassandra instinctively straightened her back, even though the movement sent a sharp jolt of pain through her ribs. "So this is the girl my grandson brought home," the woman said, her voice deep and commanding. "I am Sofia Castellano, Alexander's grandmother. I wanted to meet the one who made my grandson do something he hasn't done in 26 years. Cassandra swallowed, unsure what to say. "What is that?" she asked softly. Sofia moved closer to the bed, pulled a chair over, and sat down, her movements unhurried, yet carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders all her life. "Caring about a stranger," she said, her eyes studying Cassandra as if reading every page of her soul. "Alexander doesn't save people. He doesn't bring strangers into his home. He doesn't sit beside anyone's bed all night to make sure they don't die. But he did all of that for you." Cassandra froze. He stayed with me all night, she thought. She hadn't known. She had assumed she was just an inconvenience, a problem he'd accidentally picked up and was waiting to deal with. "You want to know why, don't you?" Sofia asked, as if reading her thoughts. Cassandra nodded, unable to speak. Sofia was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting as though into the past. Then she began to speak, her voice softer now, yet each word heavy as stone. 26 years ago, Alexander was 10 years old. His father, my son, was an alcoholic and a violent man. I tried to protect my daughter-in-law and my grandson, but I couldn't be with them every hour of every day. One night, my son was drunk, consumed by baseless jealousy, and he pulled out a gun and shot his wife right in front of Alexander. Cassandra covered her mouth as tears spilled over. Sofia went on, her voice hardening like steel. "Alexander stood there for 2 hours, alone, in the rain, beside his mother's body, until my brother found him. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't do anything. He just stood there, watching his mother die with no one coming to save her. I took him in after that, raised him, taught him everything he knows today. But there are wounds time can't heal, child. Alexander doesn't believe in family. He doesn't believe in love. He doesn't believe in human kindness. He built a wall around his heart and no one has ever crossed it." Sofia looked at Cassandra, her expression softening just slightly. "Until he saw you lying by the road that night. He told me that when he looked at you, he saw himself. The 10-year-old boy he once was, abandoned, betrayed by the people who should have loved him most. And this time, he could do what no one had done for him. He could save you. Cassandra broke down completely, tears streaming down her face and onto her hands. She understood now. She understood why Alexander looked at her the way he did, why he saved her when he had no reason to. They were alike, both betrayed by their own families, both carrying scars no one could see, both utterly alone in the world. Sophia stood, placing her wrinkled hand gently on Cassandra's shoulder. "I don't know who you are, or what happened to you," she said, "but I know this. My grandson chose to save you, and Alexander never does anything without a reason. Perhaps you came into his life for a purpose none of us understand yet." She left the room, leaving Cassandra alone with her tears and a heart pounding with emotions she didn't yet have a name for. 1 week after that fateful night, Alexander personally drove Cassandra to her grandmother Margaret's house. The black Maybach glided along the familiar roads Cassandra had tried to walk during the storm, and she couldn't stop thinking about how different everything would have been if she had reached this place on her own 2 feet. She sat in the back seat, still hurting when she took a deep breath, her wrist neatly bandaged, but far stronger than she had been that night. Alexander sat beside her, silent as always, eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. He had called Margaret on the second day. Cassandra knew that because Lorenzo had told her. Her grandmother had cried on the phone when she learned her granddaughter was alive and had wanted to rush to the estate immediately, but Alexander had convinced her that Cassandra needed rest and would be brought home once she was strong enough to travel. The car stopped in front of the small house with its red-tiled roof and a garden full of daisies Cassandra had missed every single day of that week. Before the driver could even open the door, the front door flew open and Margaret rushed out. A 67-year-old woman with silver hair and green eyes identical to Cassandra's mother's and to Cassandra's own. She couldn't run fast, but she tried anyway, and when Cassandra stepped out of the car, Margaret wrapped her in a fierce embrace as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "My girl," Margaret sobbed, her tears soaking Cassandra's shoulder. "I thought I'd lost you. I called your house. I called the police. I called everyone, but no one knew where you were. Richard said you ran away, said you were an addict, but I didn't believe him. I know my granddaughter. I know." Cassandra cried in her arms, cried like she never had before. All the pain, humiliation, and fear she had held inside for the past week finally breaking free. Margaret was the only one who believed her, the only one who loved her. She was home. Alexander stood by the car, quietly watching the two of them cling to each other. His face held its usual unreadable calm, but his gray eyes looked different, softer, distant, as if he were seeing something from long ago. Perhaps he was thinking of his own mother, of an embrace he would never feel again. Margaret finally lifted her head and looked at Alexander. She wiped her tears, gently set Cassandra aside, and stepped toward the man the entire city feared. She didn't bow or tremble. She looked him straight in the eyes with the gaze of a woman who had lived long enough to fear nothing except losing those she loved. "You saved my granddaughter," Margaret said, her voice shaking but sincere. "I don't know why a man like you would do that, but I owe you the life of my only grandchild. I have nothing to give you except the gratitude of an old woman." Alexander studied her for a long moment, then spoke, his voice low but not cold as usual. "You don't owe me anything. Just love her." Margaret nodded, tears spilling again. She looked at Cassandra, then back at Alexander, and something flickered in her eyes, the look of someone who had lived long enough to see what the young often missed. "Would you come in for some tea?" Margaret asked. Cassandra was stunned, never expecting her grandmother to invite a mafia boss in for tea like a neighbor. But Alexander shook his head. "Thank you, but I have to go. There are things that need to be handled." He turned his attention to Cassandra, and for the first time all week, she saw him step toward her deliberately. He stopped a step away, reached into his jacket, and handed her a small black card. On it was a single phone number printed in silver ink. No name, no address, nothing else. "If you need anything," Alexander said, his voice still cool, though his eyes were not, "at any time, call this number." Cassandra took the card, her fingers trembling against its smooth surface. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you helping me like this?" Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, those deep gray eyes holding things she couldn't read. Then he spoke slowly, as if weighing every word. "I won't contact you. You deserve a normal life, far from my world. But if you ever need me, I'll be there." He turned and walked back to the car, and Cassandra stood there watching him, the black card resting in her palm, her heart racing with emotions she couldn't name. Before getting in, Alexander paused and added without turning around, I sent a message to the Monroe house. They won't bother you again." Then he got into the car, the door closed, and the black Maybach drove away, disappearing around the bend, carrying with it the mysterious man who had changed her life forever. Cassandra stood there for a long time, watching until there was nothing left to see, the black card in her hand like a promise, like an invisible thread tying her to a completely different world. Margaret came to her side and gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Come inside, my dear," she said softly. "I made chicken soup. You need something warm." Cassandra nodded, slipped the card into her pocket, and stepped into the small, warm house she would call home for the next 3 years. She didn't know she would keep that card for 10 years without ever using it, until the day everything changed. The first 3 years Cassandra lived with her grandmother Margaret were the happiest years of her life, even though that happiness was built on a foundation of loss and pain. Margaret had 3 house rules: breakfast at 8, homework finished before television, and no nonsense talk before she finished her morning coffee. Simple rules. Yet to Cassandra they were proof of love, the structure she needed to heal the wounds left by the Monroe house. Margaret helped her re-enroll in school, submit new scholarship applications, and when Cassandra received another acceptance letter from Boston University with a full scholarship, her grandmother cried like a child. "Your mother would be so proud," she said, holding Cassandra tightly. Cassandra didn't know that the scholarship had been quietly supplemented by an anonymous source to cover all her living expenses. She believed it was simply state assistance for students from difficult backgrounds. She also didn't know that whenever anyone from the Monroe house came near Margaret's neighborhood, they were warned away by men in black suits who appeared from nowhere. Alexander kept his promise. He didn't contact her, but he didn't leave her unprotected either. But life never allows anyone too much happiness at once. When Cassandra was 20, in her second year of college, her grandmother Margaret passed away suddenly in her sleep. The doctor said it was old age. Her heart had been weak for a long time, and she went peacefully without pain. But to Cassandra, it was the second collapse of her entire world. She stood alone beside the coffin, with no one else present. Richard didn't come. Rachel didn't come. Patricia didn't come. No one from the family that claimed her bothered to acknowledge that the greatest woman they had ever known was gone. Cassandra arranged the funeral herself, greeted guests herself, and buried her grandmother in the cold ground with her own hands. She didn't cry in front of anyone. She saved her tears for the late nights, when it was only her, the darkness, and endless loneliness. The weeks after the funeral were hell. Cassandra collapsed completely. She stopped going to class, stopped eating, and lay inside the small house her grandmother had left her, unable to do anything at all. She thought about giving up, about disappearing from the world like her mother, like her grandmother, like everyone who had ever loved her. Then she remembered Margaret's words before she died. "Never let the past define your future," Margaret had said one afternoon as they drank tea on the porch. "You survived the storm that year. You can survive anything." 1 week after the funeral, when Cassandra opened the door to collect the mail, she found a plain white envelope with no name tucked beneath the doormat. Inside was cash, enough to cover 3 months of living expenses, and nothing else. No letter, no explanation, no sign of who had sent it. But Cassandra knew. She took out the black card she had kept in her wallet for 3 years, stared at the phone number printed in silver ink, and she knew exactly where the envelope came from. She didn't call, she didn't reach out, but she didn't return the money either. She treated it like an invisible thread, a reminder that somewhere out there, someone was still watching her, still protecting her from a distance. Cassandra stood up again. She returned to school, completed her degree, and graduated with honors in nursing. She secured a job at St. Mary Hospital, working the night shift. The hardest shift no one wanted, but one she accepted without hesitation. She worked 12 hours a day, sometimes more, not because she loved the job, but because she needed the exhaustion to keep her from thinking about what she had lost. The envelopes kept coming every month for the next 7 years. Cassandra never spent that money. She stored it all in a box beneath her bed, like a secret treasure, like proof that the stormy night when she was 17 had not been a dream. She moved into a small apartment in Boston near the hospital and lived alone, without close friends, without a lover, without anyone close enough to see the scars she hid inside. The scar on her left wrist faded with time, but she still wore a bracelet to cover it, out of habit, out of a need to remind herself of the night she nearly died and the man who saved her. Alexander Castellano. 10 years passed, and she never saw him again. Yet there wasn't a single day she didn't think of him, of his steel gray eyes, his deep, commanding voice, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious. The black card remained in her wallet, the phone number memorized, though never dialed, until the day a letter arrived from a nursing home, and everything began to change. Cassandra sat in her small Boston apartment, the letter from Maple Grove Nursing Home lying on the kitchen table, her father's shaky handwriting etched into cheap paper. She had read the letter over and over for 3 days, and every time she did, her emotions rose like waves crashing inside her. Richard wrote that he'd suffered a stroke 2 years earlier, that the left side of his body no longer functioned. Patricia had left with a man she'd met online, taking half of what little remained. The house was sold, his career was gone, and he lay in a nursing home with nothing but regret for company. He said he wanted to see her once before he died. He said he was sorry. 10 years of silence. And now he was sorry. Cassandra didn't know how she was supposed to feel. She was angry. That much was certain. Angry that he'd believed Rachel's lies. Angry that he'd torn her future apart. Angry that he'd thrown her into the storm like something disposable. But she was also tired. Tired of carrying hatred for 10 years. Tired of letting the past haunt her dreams. Every rainy night. Every quiet moment when she was alone. She needed someone to talk to. Someone who understood what she'd been through. Someone who wasn't just a polite coworker or a distant neighbor. And before she could stop herself, her hand reached for her wallet, pulled out the black card worn at the edges by time, and stared at the phone number she'd memorized for 10 years but had never dared to dial. Her fingers trembled as she entered each digit. Her heart raced as the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. She almost hung up, thinking this was the stupidest idea she'd ever had, thinking 10 years had passed and he'd surely forgotten who she was. Then the line picked up, and a deep voice spoke. The voice she'd heard in her dreams hundreds of times over the past decade. Cass. Just one word. Her name. He remembered. He knew it was her the moment he answered, as if he'd been waiting for this call for 10 years. As if that number had existed for one person only. Cassandra opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Tears spilled before she could stop them, running down her cheeks and dripping onto the black card in her hand. "I need to see you," she finally managed, her voice breaking into fragments. 30 minutes later, there was a knock on her apartment door. Cassandra opened it and found him standing there. Alexander Castellano, 10 years later. He was still as tall as she remembered, shoulders still broad, face still sharply carved with the scar running from his temple to his cheekbone. But some things had changed. Silver threaded his hair at the temples. Faint lines framed his eyes, and those gray eyes she remembered as cold as steel now looked at her with something warmer. Softer. Like ice worn down by time. He wasn't wearing a suit as she'd imagined, only a black shirt and dark trousers, as if he'd come straight here the moment he got her call without stopping to prepare. Cassandra stood there staring at him, and everything she'd planned to say vanished. She could only stand there, tears falling, feeling as if the past 10 years hadn't existed at all, as if she were still the 17-year-old girl lying by the roadside in the rain, and he was still the man who saved her. Alexander said nothing. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and stood there looking at her with endless patience. He waited, the way he'd waited for 10 years, the way he'd keep waiting for as long as she needed. Cassandra took a deep breath, wiped her tears, and told him about the letter, about her father, about Rachel, about the 10 years she'd tried and failed to forget the past. He listened without interrupting, without judgment, giving her his full attention as if what she was saying mattered more than anything else in the world. And when she finished, when she asked him what she should do, Alexander looked at her with those deep gray eyes and said something she would remember forever. "You don't go to see him because he deserves it. You go because you deserve to be free from the hatred. I'll go with you, if you want." Maple Grove Nursing Home was about an hour's drive from Boston. An aging building with yellowed walls and a sharp disinfectant smell desperately trying to mask the scent of decay. Cassandra sat in the black Maybach beside Alexander, staring out the window without truly seeing anything. Her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and she had to remind herself to breathe, in and out, in and out. 10 years. 10 years since the last time she had seen her father. Since the night he had thrown her into the storm like a bag of trash. And now she was about to face him. Not as the broken 17-year-old girl she once was, but as a 27-year-old woman who had built her life from ashes. Alexander walked beside her as they entered the building, not touching her, yet his presence felt like a solid wall she could lean against at any moment. He told her he would wait just outside the room, that she could have privacy to speak with her father, but he would be right there if she needed him. Richard Monroe's room was small and bleak. A single bed, a window overlooking the parking lot, a television mounted on the wall playing a program no one was watching, and on the bed lay the man who had once been her father. Cassandra almost didn't recognize him, Richard Monroe was 62 years old but looked closer to 80, his face gaunt, skin wrinkled and gray, the entire left side of his body completely motionless. His eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with disgust and contempt 10 years ago, were now cloudy and filled with tears when he saw her step inside. "Cassandra," he said her name, his voice trembling and weak, nothing like the roar of that stormy night. "You came. I didn't think you would." Cassandra remained by the door, not moving closer. She looked at the man on the bed, at his deterioration, and she didn't know what she felt. Not satisfaction, as she once imagined she might. Not pity, because he didn't deserve pity. Just a strange emptiness, like looking at a stranger she had known in another lifetime. Richard began to cry, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks as he tried to speak through broken sobs. "I'm sorry," he repeated again and again like a damaged refrain. "I know I was wrong. I learned the truth a few years after that night, when Rachel let it slip while she was drunk. I knew you were innocent. I knew you were framed. I knew I did the worst thing a father could ever do to his child, but I was too much of a coward to look for you, too ashamed to face you. I thought you would be better off without me in your life." Cassandra listened, and something ignited in her chest. She stepped closer to the bed, looked straight into her father's eyes, and spoke the words she had carried inside her for 10 years. "Do you know I almost died that night?" she asked, her voice strangely calm despite the fire inside her. "I walked 9 miles in a storm. I was hit by a car. I broke 2 ribs. I was bleeding from my head, lying in my own blood on the side of the road. If no one had found me, I would have died. Grandma died when I was 20. I handled her funeral alone. I went to college alone. I built my career alone. You weren't there for a single moment. No birthdays, no graduation, nothing. I lived like an orphan while you were still alive." Richard sobbed uncontrollably, his body shaking as he tried to lift his one functioning arm toward her, as if to touch her, as if to pull her close. But Cassandra didn't move closer. She stood there, looking down at the man who had once been her entire world, the man she had loved and longed to be loved by, and she said what she had come to say. "I forgive you." Richard lifted his head, eyes wide in shock, and Cassandra continued, her voice steadier than ever. "But you need to understand what forgiveness means. It doesn't mean I forget. It means I choose not to carry this hatred anymore, because it's heavy and it's been dragging me down. You threw me into a storm because you believed a lie. You didn't believe it because the evidence was convincing. You believed it because it was easier, because Rachel made you feel good about yourself, and I reminded you of my mother, of everything you had lost. You chose comfort over truth. You chose a lie over your own daughter." She paused, took a deep breath, and spoke her final words. "I built my entire life without you. I have a career. I earned myself. I have a life I created on my own. I'm happy, Dad, even though you weren't there. And you will have to live with what you did. That burden is no longer mine. It's yours." Richard nodded, tears still falling, and whispered 2 words Cassandra knew he would carry with him until his last breath. "I know." Cassandra stood there a few more moments, took one final look at her father, then turned and walked out of the room. She didn't hug him. She didn't hold his hand. She didn't promise to return. She had come. She had spoken. She had forgiven. And that was enough. Cassandra stepped out of her father's room with a heart lighter than it had been in 10 years, as if she had finally set down a massive stone she had carried on her shoulders for so long. She drew in a deep breath, preparing to walk toward Alexander, who was waiting at the end of the hallway, when a voice rose behind her and brought her to a sudden stop. "Sister," the voice was sweet and poisonous. The same voice Cassandra had heard in her nightmares for 10 years. She turned and saw Rachel standing there beside the waiting area, clearly having waited, clearly knowing Cassandra would come today. Rachel was 32 now, but looked older, the once sharp beauty of her face etched with bitterness, her hair dry and unevenly dyed, her cheap clothes and worn heels speaking of a life that had not turned out as planned. In her eyes was a look Cassandra recognized instantly, hatred, yet beneath it something else. Desperation hidden behind arrogance, a fracture she was trying to conceal. 10 years, Rachel said as she stepped closer. "And you look pretty good. I hear you're a nurse now. Night shifts. Must be exhausting." Cassandra didn't move, didn't step back, didn't show fear. She was no longer the fragile 17-year-old girl she had once been. She had survived hell, built a life from nothing, and she wasn't going to let this woman threaten her ever again. "What do you want?" Cassandra asked, her voice cold and steady. Rachel laughed, a shrill sound echoing through the empty hallway. "What do I want? I want to know what you said to him." I want to know how much more poison you poured into his head to make him hate me even more. Ever since he learned the truth, he won't even look at me. He refuses to see me. He says he can't look at my face without remembering what happened. This is all your fault. Cassandra looked at Rachel, at the madness burning in her half-sister's eyes, and felt an unexpected pity. Not pity for what Rachel had done, but pity for the emptiness she was living with. Rachel had spent her entire life hating, envying, destroying others, and what did she have left? A father who refused to see her, a small and hollow life, and a heart so full of bitterness it would never be satisfied. You did this to yourself, Cassandra said, her voice not angry, just true. You staged everything. You framed me. You pushed me into a storm hoping I'd die. I'm alive not because you showed mercy, but because someone saved me. 10 years ago, you tried to kill me. Don't ever appear in front of me again. Rachel went pale, then flushed with rage. She lunged toward Cassandra, her hand raised as if to strike, her mouth screaming curses Cassandra didn't bother to hear. But before Rachel could touch her, a hand appeared from nowhere and clamped around Rachel's wrist. Alexander stood there, tall and commanding, his gaze so cold the air itself seemed to freeze. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to leave Rachel frozen in place. Rachel looked at him, at the expensive suit, the watch worth tens of thousands on his wrist, the scar cutting across his angular face, and she understood. Her eyes widened in terror. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She knew who he was. Everyone in the city knew who Alexander Castellano was, and now she understood why men in black suits had warned the Monroe household 10 years ago. Why a black rose had appeared on her pillow. Why Patricia had fled the house in fear. Alexander released Rachel's wrist, gently, yet with unmistakable contempt, as if letting go of an insect he didn't bother to crush. He placed a hand on Cassandra's back, a protective and sheltering gesture, and gave Rachel one final look she would remember for the rest of her life. Don't ever go near her again. Just 6 words, spoken in a flat, calm voice, yet heavier than any threat. Rachel collapsed into a chair, her face drained of color, her hands shaking, able only to watch as Cassandra and Alexander walked away down the hallway, taking with them every hope of revenge she had ever clung to. Cassandra stepped out of the nursing home with Alexander beside her and didn't look back even once. She had faced the past, forgiven her father, confronted Rachel, and she had won, not through revenge, but by living a life they could never touch. The black Maybach glided along the road back toward Boston, and Cassandra sat in silence by the window, staring out without truly seeing anything. She had been strong all day, strong while facing her father, strong while confronting Rachel, strong as she walked out of the nursing home with her head held high. But now, in the quiet, enclosed space of the luxury car, with Alexander seated beside her and no one else watching, the wall she had built over 10 years suddenly collapsed. Tears spilled before she could stop them, sliding down her cheeks and onto her lap, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hold them back. She cried without sound, her shoulders shaking in waves, one hand covering her mouth to stifle the sobs, but her body betrayed her. 10 years of holding everything in, of pretending she was fine, of living as if the past no longer touched her. But it did. It always had. Every rainy night, every nightmare, every lonely moment, the past was there, lurking, waiting for the instant she grew weak enough to break. Alexander said nothing. He only signaled the driver to pull over and then stayed where he was, silent, letting her cry. He didn't offer hollow comfort, didn't say everything would be okay, didn't do anything except remain there beside her, like a solid wall she could lean against. And that silence, strangely enough, was exactly what she needed. When Cassandra finally calmed down, when the tears had dried and the sobbing had faded, she turned to look at Alexander with swollen, reddened eyes. "Why did you do all this for me?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. 10 years ago you saved me. You sent me money every month. You protected me from a distance without ever asking for anything. Today you brought me here. You stood between me and Rachel. Why I'm no one. Why would you do all of this for me?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the window, on the horizon where the sky was shifting toward dusk. Then he spoke, his voice low and deliberate, as if every word carried extra weight. "Because that night, I didn't see a stranger lying by the road. I saw myself." Cassandra watched him, waiting. And Alexander, the man the entire city feared, the man who never showed weakness to anyone, began to tell his story. "I know my grandmother told you what happened that night," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "She probably told you about the rain and how long I stood there. but she couldn't tell you làm thế nào cái lạnh đó không chỉ chạm vào da thịt, mà nó đã thấm sâu vào linh hồn tôi. For 26 years, I lived in that silence, paralyzed by the moment the world stopped, and I spent a lifetime hating the boy who couldn't move. He turned to look at Cassandra, and for the first time she saw something in his gray eyes she had never seen before. Vulnerability and honesty. But when I saw you on that road, he added softly, I finally understood why I survived. I couldn't save my mother, but I could save you. Cassandra cried again, tears flowing freely, but these were different tears, not of pain or despair, but of understanding, of connection with the man sitting beside her. They were the same, both carrying scars no one could see, both betrayed by those who should have loved them most, both alone in the world, and somehow, fate had brought them together on a rainy night 10 years ago. Thank you, Cassandra whispered, for saving me. Not just that night, but every year after. Alexander looked at her, and for the first time in all the years she had known him, she saw the faintest smile touch his lips, rare and gentle, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. You don't need to thank me, he said. You're the only person in my life who's never wanted anything from me. You're not afraid of me. You don't want my money or my power. You just look at me like I'm human. That's why I want to give you everything. He turned away before Cassandra could respond, and motioned for the driver to continue. And Cassandra sat there, her heart racing, watching the man beside her, knowing something was changing between them, something they both felt, something neither of them was ready to name out loud. Rachel Monroe didn't sleep for 3 nights after the encounter at the nursing home. She lay awake in her cheap rented apartment on the outskirts of Boston, staring at the peeling ceiling while the hatred inside her boiled like a volcano on the brink of eruption. The image of Cassandra walking beside Alexander Castellano haunted her every time she closed her eyes. The way the most powerful man in the city placed his hand on her half-sister's back with unmistakable protection. The way he looked at Rachel with pure contempt, as if she were nothing more than an insect. 10 years ago, Rachel had thought she'd won. She had driven Cassandra out of their lives, claimed their father for herself, and believed that the unwanted sister would die on the street that stormy night. But Cassandra hadn't died. She'd survived, built a life, and now she had something Rachel never would, the protection of the most feared mafia boss in Boston. And what did Rachel have? Patricia had left with another man, taking the money and never looking back. Their father lay in a nursing home, refusing to see her, calling her a murderer even if she had never pulled the trigger herself. Her job was unstable, her money nearly gone, and with every passing day, Rachel sank deeper into bitterness. But Rachel wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat. She had spent her entire life hating, envying, plotting to destroy whatever Cassandra touched. And if she couldn't reach Cassandra herself because Alexander stood in the way, she would find someone who could. 3 days after the confrontation, Rachel began to search. She questioned people from the lowest tiers of the criminal world, addicts and small-time dealers, the same kind she had used years earlier to frame Cassandra. She asked about Castellano's enemies, about anyone who wanted him destroyed, about anyone willing to help her get revenge. Eventually, she found him. Victor Marchetti, the leader of a rival crew, a man who had lost 2 brothers in a brutal territorial war with Castellano 5 years earlier. Victor hated Alexander even more than Rachel hated Cassandra, and when Rachel approached him with the promise of a weakness, a girl, he listened. Rachel told him everything. About Cassandra, about her night shifts as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, about the small apartment where she lived alone in Boston, about the way Alexander protected her like his most precious possession. Rachel told him that if they took Cassandra, they could force Alexander to do anything, or at the very least destroy him by destroying the one thing he cared about most. Victor smiled, the smile of a venomous snake spotting its prey. He agreed to help, not because he cared about Rachel's vendetta, but because this was the perfect chance to strike at the heart of Alexander Castellano. 1 week later, on a drizzling October night, Cassandra finished her 12-hour shift at St. Mary's Hospital. She exited through the staff door at the back, her body exhausted but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. In recent weeks, she and Alexander had been seeing each other more often, sometimes just dinner, sometimes just sitting together in silence. But every time they met, she felt something growing between them, something warm and safe she'd never felt with anyone else. Cassandra was thinking about Alexander as she passed the dark alley leading to the parking lot. She didn't notice the black van parked in the corner. She didn't notice the figures hiding in the shadows. She only heard hurried footsteps behind her, felt something pulled over her head, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and then she was lifted off the ground and dragged into the vehicle before she could even scream. Cassandra fought, clawed, struggled with everything she had, but she was slender, and they were large men trained for this exact thing. A punch slammed into her stomach, knocking the air from her lungs. Then something sharp pierced her neck, a needle, and cold liquid spread through her veins. The world began to spin. Just before consciousness slipped away completely, Cassandra heard a familiar voice, a voice she'd hoped never to hear again, speaking from somewhere inside the van. "Hello, little sister," Rachel said, her tone dripping with cruel satisfaction. Surprise. Then darkness swallowed Cassandra whole, and she knew nothing more. Alexander knew something was wrong the moment Cassandra didn't answer her phone after her shift. She always called him when she got off work, a habit they had formed over the past few weeks, and her silence triggered the instincts of a man who had lived in the shadows for 26 years. He called Lorenzo, sent men to the hospital, and within 30 minutes the report came back. Cassandra had been kidnapped in the parking lot behind the hospital. Security cameras had captured a black van and masked men dragging her inside. And one woman without a mask, her face clearly visible under the streetlight, Rachel Monroe. Alexander stood in his office, staring at the still images Lorenzo had sent, and the rage inside him didn't burn like fire. It froze, cold and lethal, the kind of anger belonging to a professional killer who had already decided his prey's fate. Lorenzo entered, his face tight with urgency. "We've located them," he said. "An abandoned warehouse in the southern industrial zone. It's Victor Marchetti's territory. This is a trap, boss. He wants you there so he can kill you. I'll mobilize everyone. We'll hit them from all sides and wipe them out." "No." Alexander cut him off, his voice ice cold. "I'm going alone." Lorenzo stared at him, convinced he'd misheard. "Alone, boss, that's suicide. Marchetti has at least 30 men in there. He's waiting for you. He wants you dead." Alexander looked at Lorenzo, his closest friend, the man who had stood beside him for 20 years, and said something Lorenzo would never forget. "If she dies because I bring an army and a firefight breaks out, I'll never forgive myself. I'm going alone. If I'm not back in 2 hours, level the place." He didn't wait for a response. He took 2 guns, slid them into his waistband, and stepped into the night. The warehouse where Cassandra was being held loomed like a concrete beast in the abandoned industrial district. Dim lights glowed inside, and Alexander could see shadows moving past broken windows. He didn't sneak in. He walked straight to the front door, shoved the rusted metal wide open, and stepped inside as if he owned the place. Victor Marchetti sat on a chair like a throne, surrounded by more than 20 gunmen aiming directly at Alexander. In the middle of the floor, Cassandra was tied to a chair, her mouth taped shut, her eyes wide with terror when she saw him walk in alone. Rachel stood beside Victor, her face triumphant, as if she'd already won. "Castellano," Victor said with delight. "You finally came. Alone. Are you insane or just arrogant?" Alexander didn't look at Victor. He looked straight into Cassandra's green eyes, filled with tears and fear, and spoke to her even though he knew she couldn't answer. "I'm here. Everything's going to be okay." Then he turned to Victor, his gray eyes cold as steel. "Let her go. This is between you and me." Victor laughed, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. "Let her go. After all the trouble I went through to get her. Not a chance. I'm going to kill you first, slow and painful, and then I'll deal with her. Or maybe I'll keep her as a gift for my men. She's pretty." Cassandra trembled, tears streaming down her face, and something inside Alexander shattered. Not fear. He hadn't known fear in a long time. But rage, pure and devastating. The rage he had buried since the night his mother died. What happened next unfolded too fast for anyone to react. Alexander drew his gun faster than the eye could follow, and before Victor could give the order to fire, the 2 gunmen closest to Cassandra dropped with bullets through their foreheads. Chaos exploded. Gunfire roared like fireworks, bullets tearing through the air. But Alexander moved like a ghost, swift and deadly, every shot finding its mark. He wasn't a boss who sat behind a desk. He was a killer forged from the age of 16, a perfect combat machine his uncle had created. In less than 3 minutes, 15 men lay dead. The rest fled in panic, terrorized by the living demons slaughtering their crew. Victor tried to grab Cassandra as a hostage, but Alexander was faster. A bullet tore through Victor's shoulder, making him scream and release her. Alexander didn't kill Victor right away. He went to Cassandra, cut her bonds, ripped the tape from her mouth, and pulled her into his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You came," Cassandra sobbed, clinging to him. "I knew you would." Alexander held her tight, ignoring the blood from the wound in his arm soaking into her clothes, ignoring Victor groaning on the floor, ignoring everything. "I'll always come," he whispered into her hair. "Always." When Lorenzo and the Castellano men arrived 10 minutes later, they found a warehouse filled with bodies, a rival boss critically wounded, and Alexander holding Cassandra in his arms. Victor Marchetti was handed over to the police with enough evidence to put him away for life. As for Rachel, she was found hiding in a corner of the warehouse, shaking like a leaf, her face drained of color with terror. Alexander didn't kill her. He let her live, but the life that followed was worse than death. Her identity was exposed to every gang in the city as a traitor who had brought disaster. She lost her job, her home, everything, and was forced to flee Boston and live in fear for the rest of her life. That was Alexander's punishment for her. To live with fear, to live with loneliness, to live knowing she had destroyed herself. 1 year after that terrifying night, Cassandra stood by the window of the Castellano estate, watching the October rain pour down over the garden. She no longer lived in a small Boston apartment, no longer returned home alone after endless night shifts. She was still a nurse, because it was her calling, the way she healed herself by healing others. But every evening when her shift ended, a black car waited to take her home, to the place she now called home, to the man the entire city feared, yet who would kneel to tie her shoes without a second thought. Alexander was still a mafia boss, still cold and ruthless to his enemies, still a name that made powerful men tremble. But to Cassandra, he was the man who read to her every night before sleep, the man who played the piano in the living room when he thought no one was listening, the man who held her tightly whenever nightmares of that long-ago rainy night returned. They hadn't married in the traditional sense. Alexander's world didn't allow for ordinary ceremonies, but everyone in the Castellano family knew that touching Cassandra meant touching Alexander, and no one was foolish enough to test that truth. Sophia, Alexander's grandmother, had accepted Cassandra as her granddaughter-in-law long ago, saying she was the light this house had needed, the thing her grandson had searched for his entire life without realizing it. Footsteps sounded behind her, and Cassandra felt familiar, arms wrap around her waist, the warmth of Alexander's chest settling against her back. "Are you still afraid of the rain?" he asked softly near her ear. Cassandra smiled and turned to kiss his cheek. "Not anymore," she said, "because the rain brought you to me." They stood there in silence, watching the rain fall, and Cassandra thought about the journey that had led her here. 10 years earlier, she had been pushed into a storm with the hope that she would die. She had lost her family, lost her home, lost the innocent 17-year-old girl she once was, but she had found something else. She had found strength within herself, found love through her grandmother Margaret even after she was gone, found purpose in her work as a nurse, and found the man the world feared who looked at her as if she were his entire universe. Richard had passed away 3 months earlier, peacefully in his sleep, and Cassandra had attended the funeral, not because she had fully forgiven him, but because she had learned that forgiveness was a gift she gave herself, not the person who had hurt her. Rachel was still running somewhere, living in fear and loneliness, and Cassandra no longer thought about her. The past was the past, and she had chosen to live in the present, in the happiness she deserved. Sometimes a storm isn't sent to destroy you. It's sent to carry you to where you belong, into the arms of a destiny you never dared to dream of. Her name is Cassandra Monroe, and this is the story of how one October rainy night changed her life forever. This story brings us a profound lesson about life. That betrayal by those we love most can be the deepest wound, but it doesn't define us. That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or accepting what was wrong, but freeing ourselves from the weight of hatred. That sometimes the worst things lead us to the best outcomes, and light often emerges from the darkest places. If you're going through a difficult time, remember that the storm will pass, and you're far stronger than you think. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our daily videos. Don't forget to like and share this video with those you care about, because it might offer the inspiration they need. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of something from your own life? We'd truly love to hear your thoughts from the heart, because every comment gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful content. Please leave a comment below and share your feelings. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Thank you so much. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.